What's going on, everybody? Welcome to the Always Hope podcast, a production of Willwood's Faith in Marriage. This is Dr. Mario Sacasa, and I pray that you're having an amazing day today. Well, many blessings to you, and thank you so much for joining me on the show, because today is an important episode. We love to talk about things that matter, and sincerely, it seems like this question related to gender ideology, the transgender movement, freedom of speech, religious liberty, and what the church has to say and how the church is responding to these issues seems to be really, really topical for what's going on in our culture today. And so I am grateful to have with me today John Bursch. He is the Vice President of Appellate Advocacy for Alliance Defending Freedom. John also is the author of a new book called Loving God's Children, The Church and Gender Ideology, which is published by Sophia Institute Press. In today's episode, we talk about why the church cares about these issues, the dictatorship of relativism, and the need for dialogue with those who think differently than us. We also discuss the church's understanding of the human body and the human person, the need to find meaning in our suffering, what the science says about best practices for treating gender dysphoria, and the impact of laws that are affecting free speech, particularly as it pertains to counseling, because as a therapist, these are questions that matter to me. So you're going to love this episode. And if you find it helpful, I ask you and I encourage you, please, to share it with at least one other person that you think would benefit from it, or consider leaving a rating or writing a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. So let's get into this conversation with John Bursch. John Bursch, welcome to the Always Hope podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm doing terrific. Thank you.
Yeah, wonderful answer. Terrific. I love hearing that. I love when people are having terrific days. So praise the Lord. Well, I am very grateful to have you on the show, and grateful to be able to dive into this conversation about your book, Loving God's Children, The Church and Gender Ideology, and to be able to go down maybe some rabbit holes also about these questions. Because this is, timely, to say the least, and I know the work that you do with Alliance Defending Freedom, you have seen front lines many of these cases that we hear about and read about in the news. And so I'm just super excited to be able to have you on the show, to be able to talk about that, to hear from your expertise, to see and listen to the things that you've witnessed. And so thank you for coming on the show.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Yeah, man. So I'll start just by this. I guess this is kind of where my heart is as we're kind of beginning this conversation, and maybe it'll speak to this a little bit. I've read a number of books about this from a Catholic perspective, and I've interviewed others related to this issue, and I feel like the church as a whole, we're trying to dialogue. As I guess my point here is, we're trying to say we understand the concerns from the other side. We understand what the secular world is trying to communicate in terms of people are hurting. There are real issues that are present. Not everybody fits into nice, clean boxes as much as we'd want them to. We understand that there's a misguided compassion that kind of guides this stuff. But at the same time, we're trying to say we can understand and appreciate the concerns that are being brought up without throwing away everything, without deconstructing society, without changing our ideas about the person, without changing our ideas about marriage, about relationships. And so I see that the church is trying to take a disposition where we're saying we want to dialogue. We want to try to engage in finding some way of meeting. We recognize we live in a pluralistic society. And so how do we engage in real dialogue? But I just feel like, and I'm not trying to say everybody, but I feel like more and more, at least in the media, that it seems like dialogue is just impossible. That maybe it's just that we're so different ideologically that we're not at a point where we can kind of engage in conversation about these things, maybe as much as we used to, or debate them in a healthy way. Because now it's just and you talk about this at the beginning of your book also, which is it's otherwise you're completely on board with gender affirming surgeries, you're completely on board with everything that the ideology is promoting, or you're a bigot and you hate people, and those are the options that are presented to you. And so it's if it's just that you're a bigot and you hate people, I'm I'm not a bigot. I don't hate anybody. You know what I mean? I have nothing against anybody. I want people to be happy also, but the question is, what does that mean? But it's the resort is always going back to straw man arguments, ad hominem attacks, and there isn't much room for dialogue to really happen here. So I don't even know. What are your thoughts about that? Kind of speak to this for me. Maybe give me a little bit of hope here, John, or no, or not. Maybe say I'm right. Just what are your thoughts? Because I know you're at the front lines of a lot of this. What have you seen, and where can dialogue even happen?
Well, that cultural box that you're talking about, where you're either for gender ideology or you're hateful and a bigot, is something that applies across Catholic teachings. It's not something that's isolated to this issue.
Right.
So you'll see that same kind of response if we're talking about the meaning of marriage from God's perspective, or if we're talking about chastity, or if we're talking about pornography or prostitution. I mean, pretty much pick the topic, and the church is always just maligned as being discriminatory and hating people.
Mm-hmm.
And it comes from this virulent strain of secular dictatorial moral relativism. Now, moral relativism being the concept that kind of really started to grow through the 80s, 90s, early 2000s, where I believe what I believe to be true, but you can have your own beliefs about what to be true. I believe that life begins at conception, but I would never force you to not have an abortion because you have your own beliefs. Kind of like an everybody get along. And then it changed. And it started to change in the mid 2010s, but I think really after Obergefell, which was supposed to be the U.S. Supreme Court decision that wouldn't affect anybody except the same-sex couples who wanted to get married. And within months after the decision, governments across the country and activist plaintiffs were forcing people to bow at the altar of same-sex marriage, or otherwise you were getting drummed out of respectful society. So I don't think it's just a gender ideology issue. I think it's a Catholic Church's morality issue. But the good news is this isn't new. We can look through the Old Testament of the Bible, through the New Testament, and every time that someone stands up to speak the truth, they're going to be maligned by popular culture. And so that's just something as Christians that we accept. We join our suffering to the cross, and we speak the truth anyway, because that's what we're called to do.
Yeah.
But I think there's more hope in it than that. And the place I want to focus is on the understanding of the word love. And we talk about this in the book. Popular conception of love is that it's just this emotional feeling, makes you feel good and all tingly and things like that. But we know from the Catechism of the Catholic Church that love actually has a much deeper meaning, that it's willing the best of the other person. And so when we engage on these debates about contraception and same-sex marriage and gender ideology, we always need to remind anyone that we're in dialogue with that we're coming from the perspective of what the church says is best for the other person, not giving into what they want, not giving into feelings, but instead what's truly best for them. And when we can go not only to the Bible, but also to science and stories, anecdotes from detransitioners and others, we can show as an objective fact that people are better off if they don't pursue puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, surgeries, and things like that, but instead align their minds with their bodies. That we have strong reasons for believing that that's not the way to human flourishing and the way to human happiness. Then hopefully we can start to regain some of that ground and the ability to dialogue. That we're not just coming across as Catholics with a bunch of no's and thumping a Bible that says one thing when culture says something else, but we really want what's best for that person too. We just have a very different vision for what's best for that person. And so let's talk about that, and we'll give you the evidence that shows why our way of thinking is actually better for that person. So if we can get to that point, we can get past that. But it's a very difficult environment to be in, and that's one of the reasons why I wrote the book, because ADF's whole mission is to keep the door open for the spread of the gospel. And people are increasingly getting shut down in their workplaces, in the public square, in governmental forums, from even talking about the gender ideology issue. It now consumes most of my docket when it comes to religious liberty and free speech issues. So it was a desire to speak into that conflict, to first try to keep the door open, but then second, to help people understand what to say if the door is open. That motivated me to write the book in the first instance. And ultimately, we're called to speak the truth even when it's hard, and so we do that.
Yeah, amen. That's beautiful. I didn't mean to cut you off there, so I'm sorry. But appreciate everything you just said, and I agree. I mean, it's beautiful. It's insightful how you said that the Obergefell case was really kind of the line, where there was a real shift that you can see culturally. And I think I felt that kind of in my own counseling practice, not practice, my own education. So I got my master's degree from 04 to 06 is when I was doing my master's, and then went back for my doctorate in 14 to 16. So it's kind of a 10-year difference there. And I saw a rapid shift, from 04 to 14 in terms of just openness. Like in 04, I could at least talk about maybe disagreements about some of these issues, we can have open conversation in the classroom. And I knew that I was one of the few people who was conservative or Christian in the classroom, but there was still an openness to having discussion or me talking about objections or how I would handle things or whatever. And I felt that even though I knew I was a minority, I felt like I was at least respected in my education system to have freedom to be able to talk about that. We get to the doctorate, and that I didn't feel that was the case at all. By then, it was very clear. There was one or two professors who still remain in openness to this, but you could see very clearly that the profession as a whole, or culturally, I would say as a whole, it was like, you're on this or you're not. And it was very clear, one or the other. And I was like, oh my, like I was more reticent, to open up and to share. I mean, I still would on occasion, and I'll share some of those stories, as we kind of move on, because I can't keep my mouth shut. That's a problem my mom always said, but it's what it is, but I felt certainly, that there was a real shift that happened there. And so this is where
can I just make one thought about that?
Please.
It's totally ironic, because if the right had shut down the left on the issue of same-sex marriage, there never would have been a same-sex marriage movement. There never would have been an Obergefell. There would have never been the law that just passed in the last 12 months, federalizing a definition of marriage that includes pretty much whatever you want to make up now.
Right.
Whatever any state would adopt. So in New York, a judge not long ago recognized plural marriage. Well, now that becomes the federal definition, because it just sucks in every unique definition of marriage that we have. So the very right, as Americans, the right to free speech, free thinking that they use to push their agenda, they're now denying to everyone else. That's the extreme irony in the movement. But that's the dictatorial nature of their moral relativism.
Yeah, I mean, moral relativism, you can't say there is no objective truth without that being an objective truth statement. Like there's no way that you can say. And so it's and I know this is rooted in a lot of Marxist socialism as well, which is to say that, institutions are bad, patriarchy is bad, but except for our version of the government. Governments are bad except for our version of it. There's always this kind of, well, which one is it? Is it just that they're all bad and they just all need to be destroyed, or is it just that your version of it is what reigns supreme? And so I think that's the dictatorial nature that you're speaking about, which you kind of feel, this kind of oppressive nature is emerging, and it's affecting all aspects of life. I recently watched this debate, the Monk debate, on it was Douglas Murray and Matt Taibbi versus Malcolm Gladwell and Michelle Goldberg, who works for the New York Times, and the debate was, can mainstream media be trusted? And Douglas Murray, in his kind of closing statements, to this debate, says that the issue at hand, he was arguing, of course, that mainstream media cannot be trusted, and his closing argument was, he said that difference of opinions is so 20th century. He says where we arguing now is differences of facts. Like this is where we're at now. Like we don't even have the same data set anymore that we work with, because everything has been filtered and aligned politically, that we don't even know what is what. And so I know you speak about stuff like that in the book as well, that it's like, well, what is it? Is it that facts matter, or is it that my feelings matter? Which one is it? Because it can't be both, So you have to tell me which one it is so we can actually kind of work with it, because the facts point one way, but feelings might move another way. And we're not disregarding feelings, but we have to, of course, play with this and recognize that we're trying to move towards what the truth is. And so, like, yeah, I mean, you're right. This isn't just about this particular issue, but this, is broadly, related to a lot of other stuff. So if we can just kind of shift the gears, and I appreciate just giving us the time to be able to talk about that kind of at the outset. One objection that I hear, let me play devil's advocate, okay, here for a second. One of the objections that I hear often is, well, why should the church even care about this? I mean, we're talking about something that affects specifically transgenderism, okay? This is gender dysphoria affects 0.0% of the population. I know those numbers are increasing, but let's just say it's a minuscule amount, a tiny amount of people. Why should the church even care about this? Like, why are we even making it? Why is this even a big deal? So I don't believe it, that question. I'm just asking it, from the devil's advocate kind of standpoint. Why should the church care? Why does the church care about this issue, John?
Well, as you mentioned, the statistics are changing rapidly on this because of cultural indoctrination, social media, educational programs in places like California, where they ask kindergartners whether they feel like a boy or a girl, and then to express their gender identity. the numbers are rising very fast. The most recent survey that I saw showed that among young people, 10% of them identify as transgender, whereas even just a couple of years ago, it was 0.00 something,
Mm-hmm.
as you mentioned. So that's a big reason to care about it. But even more fundamentally than that, the church cares about every one of its children. When Jesus had the one lost lamb,
Mm.
he went out and looked for it, even though the other 99 were already safely in the gates. And the church is the same way, that we don't want to lose a single person. And when you walk away from the church's teaching on sexual identity and our identity as sons and daughters of Christ, you're signing up for a lifetime of misery, lifetime of mental health issues, lifetime of suicidal ideation, a lifetime of procedures that permanently destroy your body and take away your fertility, and ultimately destroy your ability to relate to other people and to God himself. How can that be? Well, Pope Francis talks about this. He says that we have to accept our sex as a gift because we are embodied souls. We're not souls trapped in a body. And therefore, our bodies help express something about who we are. And so if we deny that, we lose the ability to have meaningful relationships with other people. And going even farther than that, if we can't accept our bodies as a gift from God, if we reject that gift and then take our bodies into our own hands, we can manipulate them and change them however we think is best instead of how God designed it, then we're irreparably rupturing our relationship with our Creator. And the church has always been about two things: loving God and loving your neighbor. And so if there's a whole ideology that will take even one person down a path that ruptures both of those relationships, relationship with God the Creator, relationship with our neighbor, then of course the church is going to be intensely interested in that. And as Catholics, we should be interested in that. You think about the most horrible thing that could happen to you when you're dead and you're at St. Peter's Gate, and that would be that the video is replayed where someone went to hell and they were asking, why didn't Mario tell me about Jesus Christ? Well, it's the same thing with this awful gender ideology. The folks who are detransitioning, these are individuals who transition to a different sex, typically the opposite sex, but then realize that was a mistake. So now they're detransitioning to their natal body. The question that they ask more than anything else is, why didn't anyone tell me? And you don't want to be the person that has that on your soul, that has that on your heart, that you had the opportunity to tell someone about the truth, about what's best for them, about how God loves them and what the church will do for them, how they can achieve flourishing. And instead, through silence, allowed them to suffer a lifetime of pain. So a church as an institution, all of us as individual Catholics, we are called to preach this method, even if it's only one sheep.
Yeah. Wow. Amen. Great answer. And so the church does care, and as you stated, cares deeply about ideologies, and as you stated earlier, you talked about the Old Testament, but even throughout the history of the church over 2,000 years, there's always been this awareness of heresies or movements that have led people astray or moved people in different directions, and the church is always trying to dialogue, as she's doing now, with saying, okay, well, what is the communicating that's true in that, but where's the line and what's too far? And so the church always exists in this kind of phase of saying we want to continue to move forward. We want to attend to the issues, but we also recognize that there are, as we said earlier, there are limits, and that those limits, when those lines are crossed, that there are consequences to them. And I think that's the key here, is that this is the lie, I guess, of that moral relativism, which is to say, well, all values are the same, all ideas are the same. No, they're not, unfortunately. Or even now, we think that freedom is of the utmost, so our choices almost don't have consequences anymore. It's like, well, it doesn't really matter because it's just whatever I want, and if it affects me, it affects me, but it doesn't affect others. It's like, no, the fact that it affects you detrimentally is enough for us to care, because we are a society that cares, and we're not just these individual, atoms that kind of exist in separate spaces from one another, but that we are, there is something beautiful about us as a community and about us as a family, that we do care about one another, and we want to make sure that people are attended to. And so just that statement that you said about why does the church care is because she loves, and she loves enough to be able to tell us what is true about the person, but also be able to attend to the needs of the individual. It's like this thinking that we're existing in now. It almost speaks of like this how do I say this? It's kind of like the logical kind of movement of moral relativism. It's like, how far do we keep pushing that? Well, it's not even just thoughts now. It's like, my freedom can be attained regardless of my biological constraints, regardless of physics, regardless of anything. Like, it's just what I want, and that's all that matters, and everything else is subjugated to that. And that line of thinking, of course, is quite dangerous. Dangerous for the individual, but dangerous, of course, for society as a whole that falls into that, and it creates great confusion.
Well, C.S. Lewis talks about that. He writes about society being like a fleet of sailing ships,
Mm-hmm.
and that when any one of them gets off course, then it naturally affects the rest of the fleet.
Yeah.
And when we get off course, when we stop following God's will and we start following our own will, the rise of self, it's like that ship getting off course. And what we call that is sin. And the church has recognized for its entire history that sin is never an individual thing. It never has consequences only for the person that's making the choice that's contrary to God's will. That like the sailing ships, when we sin, even when we think it's private, when we think it's in our bedroom with pornography, or a choice to pursue a transgender identity, whatever it is, that always has ripple effects. It affects our family members, our friends, because our relationships are just inexorably altered by choices like that. Pornography destroys marriages. It destroys the ability to even have relationships with the opposite sex. The pursuit of a trans identity is destroying many families now, causing conflict between parents and kids and among siblings and things like that. But even in the bigger fleet, the society writ large, when you embrace gender ideology, it has all kinds of impacts on women in privacy spaces and in sports, in the ability of Catholics and others to speak freely about the issue, to not be forced to speak the lie of using preferred pronouns instead of sex-based pronouns, to even being housed in college dormitories or prisons or homeless shelters with someone of the opposite sex, in situations where that makes you vulnerable. So that there is no such thing as private sin. And the whole idea of moral relativism being, I get to decide what's best for myself because it doesn't impact anyone, is itself a lie.
That's right. That's exactly right. And so that these have these larger impacts, and this is a much lesser impact than everything you just spoke about. But a couple of days ago, my family, we just watched WALL-E, and I love that movie. It's great. And I was just thinking about it as we were watching this movie, because it speaks to WALL-E, it's like, of course WALL-E's a guy. Like, you don't even need to see, like, you just know he's a man. Like, that's what it is, right? Because he's the robot, right. He's square. There's no question about it. And then when Eve pops up, as soon as you see the robot, like, it's a woman. You just know it is. It's like, well, how do you know it? But because you just know, that's what it is. And then she's the one, of course, that takes the life, the plant, puts it inside of her. It's just like, of course, there's just, and I was like, this is just, it was easy. And this wasn't even that long ago. This is 2008, whenever that movie came out. And it's like, can you even make a movie like that now without this having all be defined and everything? Because what it does is, as you stated, certainly everything you spoke about in terms of vulnerable populations and that, but what it's doing now is it's confusing language. It's confusing and obfuscating dialogue and conversation. You can't even read a piece where you don't know if the person that you're reading about is a woman or a man or a they or what. It's like, it creates widespread confusion, which makes it difficult to communicate and makes it difficult for us to have a shared kind of reality, a shared existence, because we genuinely are just speaking different languages. So you're hinting at this a little bit, but maybe let's just dive into this just a little bit more for people who don't know. The church's definition of the human person, okay? How is that different than what gender ideology or the secular kind of definition of the human person? What are the differences?
They start from a very, very different place. The church understands all of us, as I mentioned, to be embodied souls. In other words, our bodies are inherently part of who we are, and they express something about who we are. And gender ideology is based on this notion that our souls are just trapped in our bodies, and that our bodies are really irrelevant to who we are. And so if we know in our mind what our person is, what our soul is, then we can manipulate the body into whatever we want it to be. And for some people, that would be a different sex. Some people would choose an animal. You start hearing about people dressing up like dogs and other things. For other people, it might be something else entirely. And The difference in that is the difference in thinking about our bodies as gift. If God gave us our bodies as a gift because it says something about who we are, if we reject that gift, then we naturally assume that bad things will happen. And the gender ideologists don't see the body as a gift; they see it as a restraint.
Hmm.
And it's funny because there's no sin, there's no misguided line of thinking in culture today that hasn't been tried somewhere in the past, and that's
Right.
just as true of gender ideology as it is of all these other things. And you go all the way back to the 2nd century, very different context, but there was this Gnostic heresy, where people couldn't accept that Jesus arose from the dead, body and soul. That it must have just been his soul because the body wasn't capable of doing that. And so they separated the mind from the body. And then that evolved, with the heresy into thinking that each one of us, the goal was to elevate our souls above our bodies because material stuff is bad. And the church in the 2nd century shot that down forcefully, and said, God created the entire material world. There's nothing that God created that he did not create to be good. We may use it in evil ways. We may use it for ill purposes, but God created everything good. And that includes our body. And so, yes, our body is part of who we are. It expresses who we are. Yes, Jesus did rise body and soul. The church, snuffed out Gnosticism. But every couple of centuries, it rears its head in a different form. And today, in the 21st century, it's rearing its head as gender ideology. But the whole notion that we can just reject our body because it's shell is contrary to the nature of the gift that God gave us. And the church is really clear about that.
So the two starting points, as you stated, are vastly different. One is that there's inherent meaning to the body, and if we understand what the meaning is and we respect it, then we can see it as gift. If there is no inherent meaning, and then it is something that we can manipulate however we want. And in some cases, it actually becomes a constraint and a restraint against our capacity to be able to have genuine freedom. And it's fascinating that in a completely secular, materialistic rather, kind of disposition, that you would think that the material would be that which would be exalted. And in some cases it is, but in these cases it isn't. And that's the confusion here, is that you would think that this would be like the end would be actually that the body would be over the soul, but it's not. And it's actually because now it's disconnected of any inherent meaning. You no longer see it for what it is, and you no longer see the gift, as you've been saying, which is present, which means then that we can do whatever we want with it. We can objectify ourselves and objectify our own bodies, and then we can disregard them however we want, and that's a dangerous reality, to live by, because as you've already
certainly not one that promotes human flourishing.
No.
And it leads to numerous other sexual sins, because if my body has no meaning and someone else's body has no meaning, then the fact that we're going to engage in physical activity that should be reserved for sacramental marriage alone has no meaning. It's just purely pleasure. So this is an idea that pervades not only gender ideology, but the entire modern sexual movement.
Yeah, that it's just that. I mean, pleasure like that. So at best, that's all we can have, is this experience of pleasure. Which again, even that experience of pleasure should be oriented towards something more, towards connection, towards intimacy, towards life, towards fruitfulness. That if we just stop there, then we're stopping short of the fullness and the gift that is present.
And so, and a story that I love on that point is about Pope Paul VI encyclical Humanae Vitae.
Yep.
Where he decided once and for all that the church was not going to endorse contraception because it blocked the transmission of life in the sexual act. And he accurately predicted 50 years ahead of time what would happen to our culture if we separated the sexual act from procreation, from the gift of husband and wife engaging in a relationship where they can create a child. We would have a society where women are devalued, check. Where men treat women as objects, check. Where sexual harassment and sexual assault become pervasive, check. Where the government would even try to force contraception on people, check. I mean, people look at folks like Nostradamus and others, whose predictions didn't come true at all. And here we have this Pope acting in the 1960s, who it looks like he went forward to the year 2023
Yeah.
and then took the time capsule back to his own time and wrote down exactly what would happen to our culture if we lost the meaning of sex and lost the meaning of the body. And everything that he said came true. I mean, what a testament to the church's teaching and the nature of being able to predict the consequences of sin.
Yeah. Amen. Amen. That's exactly right. Okay. Well, here we are. All right. So here's a quote. I know you referenced this just a second ago, but I'd like to just read it in its entirety, and because you have it quoted beautifully in your book. And this is from Pope Francis, who says, "Acceptance of our bodies is vital for welcoming and accepting the entire world as a gift. Whereas thinking that we enjoy absolute power over our bodies turns, often subtly, into thinking that we enjoy absolute power over creation. Learning to accept our body, to care for it, and to respect its fullest meaning is an essential element of any genuine human ecology. That we have to be able to respect and understand and recognize the fullness of our body." And I'll take it a step further, which is not just the fullness of our body, but the fullness of our existence. And as you're speaking, this kind of came to my mind, which is that what we're seeing is that if we lost meaning of our bodies, inherent meaning of our bodies, we've lost inherent meaning in life, which also means then we lose inherent meaning of suffering. And I think that's a key here, is that if we can understand that even in God's providence, that He doesn't ordain certainly our suffering, but He allows it in His permissive will, that in our suffering then has a purpose to it, and it's something that needs to be investigated. And so whatever the crosses that we're carrying, all of us have crosses that we're carrying, circumstances that we wish weren't upon us, situations that we all experience that we wish we could just kind of get rid of in some form or fashion. But if we can stop and see our life and our experiences, which includes our suffering and our privations, through the lens of providence, through the lens of grace, well, that gives us a certain capacity to be able to look at them and to say, this isn't the final definition of my existence, but even God allows this for me for a reason. And if I can understand what that reason is, then I can grow into a better version of myself through this suffering. And so then it's through the cross, as the church proclaims, that we get to the resurrection. It's through the embracing, through picking up our crosses and following Him, that we end up becoming the saints and God wants us to be. And that's the great mystery. That's the paradox. And that paradox is completely lost, because if suffering has no meaning and suffering has no purpose, well, then the answer has to be to eliminate it at all costs. Now, of course, the church is always working to eliminate human suffering. Hospitals, thank you, the church gave us that. The missionaries of charity, thank you, Mother Teresa, for all that you've done. Continual service to the poor, love of neighbor, as you stated, has always been what the church has existed. Even universities to educate individuals. Thank you, church, for giving all these wonderful, great institutions. But that doesn't mean that even as we work towards that, we recognize that there's a certain element of the human experience that is just going to be what it is. And if we can unite that with the Lord and not try to manipulate it, not try to control it, but to come to some acceptance about it, grace permeates through that to the individual and helps to redeem that person precisely through those challenges. That notion is
I'm so glad that you brought that up, because that's the definition of modern culture, that non-Catholic modern culture rejects suffering because no one ever wants to feel pain or suffer in any respect. They don't think about joining it to the cross and the type of redemption that's good for. They don't think about the sanding down of our rough edges that suffering allows us to improve ourselves as individuals. And you can channel that right into gender ideology, in the same way that I don't want the suffering of having a child, I'll have an abortion. I don't want the suffering of having to live a chaste life because I'm same-sex attracted, I'm just going to engage in same-sex relationships. When it comes to gender ideology, it's the natural suffering that every single one of us went through as we experienced puberty and those teenage years. There's not one person that's ever existed, maybe not Mary, certainly not Jesus, who when they were 13, 14, 15 years old, didn't feel uncomfortable in their body,
right?
That they were over emotional, that they experienced depression and anxiety, that they had difficulty establishing close relationships with friends and family members. That's just part of the human condition. And what gender ideologists tell those kids is all that suffering can be avoided if you would simply change your sex. take the puberty blockers, take the cross-sex hormones, have your breasts removed, have these other surgeries to create body parts that you don't have, and we can take all that suffering away from you. And all of that is demonstrably false. We've got the scientific evidence, which I hope we can get into,
Yep.
especially in Europe, which is kind of leading the way on this.
Yep.
But we know that's scientifically false. But just as an abstract principle, it's ridiculous that you can avoid suffering in this life by manipulating your body. And yet that's what it all comes down to, because I don't want to have those negative feelings. I'm going to pursue this other course to make it all go away. And that will never work.
All right, everybody, just taking a quick break here for my conversation with John Bursch to encourage you to check out our new series that we have. Last year came out with Dating Well, which I've been grateful for, but I'm super excited to finally be able to talk about this on the podcast. For the last few months, I've been working on a new series called Overcoming Stress and Anxiety. It is available at goodcatholic.com. I'm grateful for the folks at Good Catholic who supported me throughout this project and was able to create this course for them. So head on over to goodcatholic.com, click on the series tab, and access the course that way. And what you're getting is a 21-day drip content course, which means every day you're going to have access to a new lesson. And I'm taking you by the hand and walking you through the experience of anxiety to help you better understand what it is, how to navigate it, and what are the skills that you need to develop to be able to overcome it. So of the 21 lessons, you're going to get a mix of lessons that are content heavy, where you're going to be learning more about the nature of anxiety and what you can do to overcome it. But we also have a few lessons that are guided exercises where I'm taking you and guiding you through the experience of being able to navigate it. So I'm super excited about it, just being able to help you overcome stress and anxiety. So head on over to goodcatholic.com, use the code SACASA25 at checkout to get 25% off your purchase. That also supports the channel here and the work that we're doing with Always Hope. So head on over to goodcatholic.com, use code SACASA25, access this course. You're absolutely going to love it. And I pray that it's helpful for you. We've been working hard on this for the last few months. So super excited, like I said, to be able to talk about it, to start spreading the word about it, and to getting into the hands of people who need it. So do that, and let's get back to this conversation with John. So let's talk about the science, all right? So the first time that I kind of encountered research that went counter-narrative was, as you mentioned, in Europe. Europe's kind of leading the way in this, which also I think might be its own irony. But in Sweden, there was an article that came out of Sweden that followed this longitudinal study of individuals for like 30 or 40 years, and compared the folks who had gender dysphoria and had sexual reassignment surgery, or gender affirming surgery, whatever it's called now. I don't like that term, but the reassignment surgery. And then compared to those who didn't. And it found that the individuals who had the surgery were far more likely to have suicidal ideation and suicidal attempts and suicidal completion than those who didn't, even among kind of in the same population. And I read that this was kind of at the start of my doctoral work. I would say it's probably maybe 2015, maybe I was in my doctoral studies already. And when that first kind of came to my attention, I was like, wow, this is very counter-narrative of what I'm learning in my program right now. And then Paul McHugh and Lawrence Mayer, which I know you referenced their work, and Paul McHugh, who was the chief psychiatrist at Johns Hopkins Hospital, who brought sexual reassignment surgery to the hospital over the course of his kind of career, was recognizing that, listen, if this is supposed to be a treatment, and a treatment which is to solve a disorder, if like you have a headache and you take a Tylenol's supposed to solve, this treatment for your headache. If what we're seeing is that the people who are coming in with these issues, this dysphoria, this pain that they're experiencing, if the treatment is not solving it, which is what they saw over the course of their time, that the surgeries wasn't solving the dysphoria, wasn't solving the problem, then how can we continue to refer to this treatment as viable if it's not solving the problem? Just asking those questions as a doctor. And so he started lobbying, to pull it, to stop the surgery there. And I was like, oh my gosh, these are somebody at Johns Hopkins Hospital isn't some like quack off the street. I'm sorry. I mean, I know people want to kind of just derate him now, but I'm like, this guy was like the chief psychiatrist at one of the premier institutions in our country. I mean, these are people that we have to at least listen to. And so,
and now he's persona non grata.
I know, it's like, but that's the way it works. So, and I know the research continues to support it. So what else are you seeing? You know, you have a number of articles that you reference in the book. What else is the research showing us related to transgender and gender ideology?
Yeah. First, I want to put a spotlight on that Swedish study that you talked about. Mm-hmm. Because first, some people will discredit it, you know, and say, for whatever reason, it's not worth following. But in the President Obama administration, the Department of Health and Human Services relied on it to explain to people the dangers of going through that transition. So this isn't something that just conservatives are pushing. The Obama administration doctors recognized that this was good science. Mm-hmm. And what it showed is that there is a horribly inflated suicide rate among people suffering from gender dysphoria. It's 12 times that of the rest of the population, which is why they need our compassion and they need us to walk alongside them. That's the call of the church. We need to do that. But this long-term study showed that over the long haul, that suicide rate, the number of people who died from the suicide, went up to 19 times, 12 to 19 times. So the problem got worse for some of the reasons that we've been talking about, that you can't deny the truth of your body. At some point, your body's going to rebel and your mind is going to realize that. And it wasn't just the suicidal ideation and committing suicide, it was other incidences of mental health, which also showed a decline, you know, numerous other issues. So, you know, across the board, that was true. You know, and yet in Europe in particular, which has been very friendly to the transgender movement for a long time, they continue to move forward with treatments. And any kid who expressed dysphoria, this was the way to go. So you saw that in the UK, in Sweden, and Finland, and other places. Well, now all those same countries, which are not stigmatizing of transgender people at all, that they're at the forefront of this medicine, are now all pulling back. Mm-hmm. And every single one of those countries has recently, based on scientific evidence, issued statements that now what doctors should do, at least with minors, you know, for sure with minors, is instead watchful waiting and see what happens. Because we know from studies that 80 to 95% of kids who suffer from genuine dysphoria, we're not talking about, you know, the seventh grade class where 20 girls all declare they're boys at one time. Right. There's a social contagion that results in that 10% number that we were talking about a few minutes ago.
That's right.
But from the ones who clinically have a diagnosis of dysphoria, where, you know, they actually experience difficulty because of what their mind thinks and what their body is, 80 to 95% of them will naturally align their mind with their body if left on their own. But if you start affirming them and using their preferred pronouns and encouraging them to dress as the opposite sex and using the opposite sex's restroom and shower and locker room facilities and all those things, nearly 100% of them will continue down that road of dysphoria. And ultimately then as adults, it leads to the Swedish study, worse mental health outcomes, worse suicide outcomes. You know, so it's the most unloving thing that you could do to push that. And all these European countries are recognizing that now. I mean, they said definitively they can't identify any benefit from transition of minors. And in fact, the best evidence shows that things get worse. And so here we are in the United States, and we're doing the exact opposite. We're just pushing people into it. You know, so why is that happening here? Well, first, the American Medical Association, the Psychologists Association, you know, what you were seeing in your doctoral program, all the major medical associations in the United States politically have jumped on board with this. And they're ignoring the science-based medicine that's coming out of Europe. In fact, when members of these groups at annual meetings offer proposals to just pause and study the issue, they're being voted down or shouted down in some instances, censored in other instances, so the dialogue can't even happen. There's no interest in the scientific inquiry. You talk about the losses to society from gender ideology, there are many, but one of them is the loss of the medical or the scientific method itself. You know, they just won't do it. And it's not like these organizations have a great track record. We can go back over the last half a century and time again, from smoking to drugs that have been promoted to other things, they've made mistakes because they're human. And sometimes we make mistakes. Well, this is a pretty big mistake, but they're not even considering the possibility that they could be wrong. So you see that. You see one political party using this issue as a wedge and pushing it everywhere that it can. presumably because they see it as a way to get more political power. It's a driver of electoral success. And then I think there's a whole other body of culture that pushes it. And this is really the saddest aspect of this. And these would be the parents who allowed or encouraged their kids to transition. And as a parent, if you allowed your child to do that, and then you heard about these devastating consequences, how could you ever admit the truth of the devastating consequences, to admit the fact that you would allow doctors to mutilate your own child? So it's going to be impossible for them to see past the consequences of their own choices, the fact that they acted in ways that they thought were best and loving for their children. They're never going to be persuaded. They're always going to be on the side of the political party and the doctors who are pushing this. So it's just a huge mess. And you hear all the time, follow the science. If we were honest about it and doing that in the United States, we would shut down every single gender clinic for minors. And instead, you have states which are encouraging this in their curricula, taking kids away from their parents if they have the audacity not to transition them as soon as a 6-year-old says, I'm a boy, when they were born a girl. And then fighting in the court those states that are trying to stop these offensive chemical and surgical invasions on minors, saying that it's hateful and bigoted. It's just unbelievable. It's the most clear example that I can think of in our modern culture of calling evil good. But yet you have all these forces acting in that same direction and ignoring the studies.
So where does the research come out that says it's safe and effective? Because that's what I hear.
There is none. You will not find not any reliable study. So here's an example. Just a few days ago, the University of Michigan, which has a gender clinic, they did a survey of people who of girls who had had their breasts removed as part of transition procedures. And they reported to the press that 100% of the respondents of their follow-up survey said they were happy with the procedure. That's absolute nonsense. So you start to dig into it. First, you find that it only had a 60% response rate, and they didn't bother to follow up with the 40% who didn't respond. Well, what's the most likely reason that you wouldn't respond to a survey from the University of Michigan asking if you were happy with the surgery that was performed? It's because it's gone horribly wrong for you and you've changed your mind. But yet they don't do any follow-up with them. It's a self-selective survey. In addition, the survey, it says it's long-term, but long-term to the researchers at the University of Michigan means 3 to 5 years. And you need to look at this over 10, 20, 30 years before the serious regret shows up. That's why that Swedish study is the gold standard, because it had a sample size that was significant. It was not self-selected. They looked at every single person who had undergone the surgery, and they looked at it over long periods of time. So sometimes you'll see media headlines that talk about the science going the other way. And when you dig into the details, you'll almost always find small sample size, self-selection, and short-term outcomes. And those just are not scientifically reliable. And we don't need the scientific evidence intuitively to know that there's something wrong with this. I mean, if we just think about other kinds of dysphoria, one common one, which I'm sure you're familiar with, is anorexia. And if someone has a belief that they're fat, even though the objective reality of their body is that they're not fat, they're almost certainly too skinny, we would never encourage them to eat less and to have surgery to make themselves skinnier and to eat less, because we recognize that that's bad for the human person. There's another dysphoria where people just think that part of their body doesn't belong there. And this is a real thing, as you know, they will do almost anything to have their right arm removed because it's causing them so much mental distress. And yet no psychotherapist, no counselor would ever recommend going to the doctor or handing them a saw to remove their arm because we recognize that's not what's best for them. There's no other dysphoria in psychology where we urge someone to align their body with their mind instead of their mind with their body, except for gender dysphoria. And so the science and the evidence of these studies just shows what common sense would suggest and what psychologists and therapists and counselors have always known, that you align the mind with the body, not the other way around.
That last point that you made was exactly the point that I made in one of my classes on the DSM, where we were going through the body dysphoria conditions and that psychosomatic disorder, that the one that you're speaking about with regards to the arm. And in class, we were having this discussion. They were talking about it, and I think it was like 2 weeks after we had talked about the gender kind of dysphoria stuff. So this is one of those points where I raised my hand, and asked a simple question. And I just threw the question out to the group. It was like, hey, everybody. So exactly what you said. I said, So with everything that we just spoke about, all these body dysmorphia kind of conditions, why is it that the normal course of treatment there is exactly what you said? I said the same thing. I was like, the normal course of treatment is that there's something, we want the mind to align with what the body is saying, not the other way around. Like if somebody has anorexia or it feels like they're missing an arm, we don't tell them to keep getting skinnier until you feel like you finally got to the point that you're good enough, or go ahead and cut off your arms so that the outward kind of matches what's happening interiorly. So, but when it comes to gender dysphoria, that's the only one that we do the opposite. The normal course of treatment is the opposite, where we say, hey, like let the outside kind of match what's happening interiorly. Why is that? Just asking the question, So I threw that out there, and nobody had an answer. Like it not even just didn't have an answer, but again, back to like we're talking about kind of confusion of language. They didn't even have a reference point. They didn't even know what I was asking. They just didn't even understand what the question even meant, So they're like, well, it's because, and I was like, nobody has any answer to this, It's because we're just so confused about this issue. But the point that you make is 100% right on. It's just that, again, we recognize that there's a real issue that's at work here. And that real issue is something that needs to be attended to. And that's the place of compassion. That's the place of concern. And so we can common sense say, well, we have to help this person get to a place where they come to peace with their experience within. And then that the science, supports that as well. So even here in North Carolina, we're recording this on a Thursday morning. I don't know when this show is going to come out, but I believe just yesterday, the state governor vetoed the bill that the House Republicans were pushing to ban, all gender kind of altering care for minors. And so the supermajority, and I didn't check the headlines this morning before we started the conversation, so I'm sorry, I should be a little bit more up to date. But there's enough votes within the House to be able, and the Senate to be able to override the veto. But even in the article I was reading, and this is why I brought it up, it's because in the article I was reading, you could tell that the bent of the article was clearly against it, because they always start with like, here's the issue, but then they had to throw in their line, well, but the Republicans are against safe and effective care, or whatever it is. And I was like, there it is. There's the line. So you can always kind of see where the bent is, so we want to be attentive to that.
And the culture is just insidious on that.
Yes.
The media in every single article is writing from that bias. The movies are normalizing trans characters.
Yes.
And the TV shows, even shows for little kids, introducing them to this concept and helping them to accept it at young ages. Something that I mentioned in the book is the Blues Clues.
The Blues Clues one, that one blew my mind. That one, I missed that one. I read that in the book. I was like, how did I miss the Blues Clues? I used to love Blues Clues.
Yeah, I mean, for all those moms and dads out there who plopped your kid down in front of that show when they were 3-4 years old so you could get a 10-minute break. We did that with our kids 25 years ago.
Absolutely.
Thinking that there's nothing harmful about that show, had a pride parade. Yeah. Where a transvestite sang the ants go marching one by one, but changed all the words to LGBT themes. And one of the floats in the parade was a family of beavers. And the young girl beaver had tape across her chest where she had breast removal surgery for 3 and 4 year olds. Wow. So whether it's in the newspaper or TV reporting or in any of these other cultural things, the social media is just a cesspool. TikTok, YouTube, Instagram. Millions and millions of hours of trans propaganda. And that's what they're feeding to our kids. And if we're not careful, they're going to be indoctrinated by culture instead of taught the teachings of the church.
Yes, which is why we have to, as parents, educate our kids to be smart consumers of media, help them to be able to see the things. I've had conversations with my 8-7-year-olds that I'd never had with the older siblings because it's just popping up everywhere. And so I'm helping them to see and to talk and to navigate. So and John, I've been thoroughly enjoying our conversation. I do want to spend a few minutes, please, talking about just where this issue, like where the lines are, particularly when it comes to religious liberty questions and freedom of speech. Now, if people don't know this, you have spoken to the Supreme Court, 12 times you've argued for cases? You've been in before the Supreme Court?
Yes.
That's incredible. I've never even been to the Supreme Court once in my life, and you've actually worked in there through 12 times, which is just an astounding number. It's really incredible. And so you're right at the front lines of this. And you said earlier that your docket right now, in terms of your caseload with ADF, is a lot of this right now. Where are the concerns? Like, I guess I don't even know what to ask. I'm just saying, like, I know where the concerns are. I shared this before we went on, that like, as a therapist, most conservative therapists are terrified that we're going to lose our license at some point. Like we almost accept it as like a foregone conclusion that it's just going to be revoked from us because of the changes of ethics codes, because of the change in the profession, because of laws that you stated that have been implemented in 20 states, that we feel that we're just going to lose our license. And so I guess how do I ask this question? It's really, I guess, why? I mean, why can't we find a place where there's pluralism? Why can't we find a place? Like, why is this indoctrination becoming so dictatorial? And what can we do against it if we start encountering it in our places of employment?
Yeah, I'll start with that last question and then kind of maybe back up and talk about the law a little bit more, because you're familiar with it, I'm familiar with it, but many of your listeners may not know
Correct.
what we're talking about, the counseling censorship laws or ethic rules and things like that. I think the reason why the other side is trying to shut down the conversation is because they don't want the truth to be heard. Mm-hmm. It's just like in your doctoral class, when you simply ask the question and no one had an answer. Well, the gender activists can't allow that to happen. They can't ask the question or allow the questions to be asked, because if they do, it'll cause people to second guess the agenda that they're pushing. Mm-hmm. And so their goal is to just silence all speech and debate, and then their view will carry the day. So how they're doing that with counselors and therapists are these counseling censorship laws. They have been enacted in more than 20 states. If you include local jurisdictions, big cities and things like that, it's more than 100 jurisdictions. And they're insidious laws. What they say is that if a counselor wants to encourage someone to pursue a same-sex relationship or to pursue a trans identity, then you're fine to do that, almost encouraged to do that. But if you wanted to encourage someone, even if they wanted it, consistent with their faith principles or their non-faith principles, to live a chaste life, to not pursue same-sex relationships, or in this case, to align their mind with their body, then that's labeled change therapy, derisively, mm-hmm. And it's a reason to revoke your license entirely. And so these laws are now being challenged in various federal courts. We've actually got a cert petition pending before the U.S. Supreme Court right now. A cert petition is the document you submit asking the justices to consider your case. Mm-hmm. They hear less than 1% of the cases that they're asked to hear. So this is the request that you make. And it's on behalf of a counselor in Washington State, which has one of these counseling censorship laws. His name is Brian Tingley. And in the past, he's offered therapy that helps minors who want, this is with their consent and with their parents' consent, to align their minds with their bodies. He's helped them do that through his counseling, and he wants to continue doing that. But if he does, he risks the loss of his license. And the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, it's kind of an infamous court because it's traditionally been so liberal. They're the ones that have jurisdiction over Washington federal courts. The panel said that the law was valid. And the claim that we're bringing on behalf of Mr. Tingley is that what he's engaged in is pure speech. There's no medical procedure. This isn't the old electroshock conversion therapy that people might have done in the 50s and 60s. That's discredited. No one does things like that Correct. These days. It's just words. And the First Amendment prevents the government from censoring someone's viewpoint, even if it's in the therapy context. And the Ninth Circuit panel said, well, no. When you're talking about counseling, that's medical treatment, and the government can regulate medical treatment. And so it comes down to a debate over whether counseling is pure speech or it's not. And there were some dissenters in the Ninth Circuit who said this is obviously pure speech. The 11th Circuit, which is the Federal Court of Appeals in the southeast corner of the country, starting with Florida, Alabama, Georgia, said the exact opposite, said, no, these are only conversations. We're talking about words here. The government has no ability to take one side of that debate and then not allow the other side to speak about it. So on that basis, we're asking the Supreme Court to hear it. And I have a lot of confidence in the Supreme Court that in the long haul, maybe not in Mr. Tingley's case, but we've got several others in the pipeline, that they will protect counseling speech, that they'll reject the distinction that the Ninth Circuit drew, because there are no medical interventions happening here. It's pure speech. But it is a danger to counselors in all those states. And if you're a minor detransitioner, so say you started transitioning at age 13 and at age 17, you realize that you made a tremendous mistake and you need to go to counseling to help to transition back to your natal sex identity, you can't get the help that you need in more than 20 states, in more than 100 U.S. jurisdictions. I mean, how cruel is that? That people who desperately want the counseling are prohibited by law from getting it because the counselors will lose their licenses. And as we can maybe expound on in a minute here, I'll let you jump in. This is only one of the ways that the law is acting to push the transgender agenda nationally. It's to silence our counselors.
How does the recent ruling on the Colorado web designer impact this?
It helps a lot at a broad level because that was another ADF case.
Right.
The plaintiff was Lori Smith. She owned 303 Creative. She's a website and graphic designer. And she wanted to be able to go into wedding website design so that she could celebrate God's plan for marriage between one man and one woman. But she lived in Colorado, the same state as Jack Phillips, the baker at Masterpiece Cake Shop. And the same laws applied to her. And she knew that if she did that, Colorado would also force her to celebrate something that she didn't believe was a marriage, a wedding between two men or two women. And the Supreme Court ruled in her favor, vindicated our arguments, saying that the government could not force someone to speak against their conscience. And in some sense, that's very similar to what Brian Tingley and other counselors are doing too. They're trying to speak their conscience, and the government can't force them to shut up about the things they want to say and only say the messages that the government wants to say. The twist is this idea that because this is a counseling context, somehow that gives the government more power to force words because it's medicalized. And that's just not true as a matter of constitutional law or as a matter of constitutional history.
Yeah, because the web designer, Lori Smith, was that her name? Is that right?
Yes.
That case was ruled on freedom of speech, correct? That didn't have to do with religious liberty
that we're using.
Right? It was more ruled on freedom of speech than religious liberty. That you can't
Correct.
there's no compelled speech laws that you can't force somebody to do that. And that's the challenge here. Is that, I mean, I guess truthfully, you're bringing up a great question that I haven't thought about, so I'm thinking about it now for the first time. In terms of, I don't want the government to be able to control what I say in the counseling context. And so why is it that the counseling context is viewed as something different? It's not medical in the sense that we're not doing procedures. I'm not electroshock therapy. I'm not performing surgeries on individuals. They are conversations, but it is healthcare to some degree because you are helping people. And so I'm having to think about my profession here for a second, John. You're making me kind of question, what is it that I do? So your argument is that because it's conversations, that freedom of speech applies to that. Is that right?
Yes,
Elaborate that for me.
And so just think about it historically, because that's the way that the Supreme Court looks at constitutional provisions. How would this provision have been understood at the time that it was enacted, the First Amendment? So we're talking a long time ago, 1700s there, or when the 14th Amendment was ratified, and that extended the Bill of Rights to the states. That was in 1868. And you use 1868 as the barometer. Yes, it's true that the government had authority in 1868 to regulate dangerous medical procedures. So, say that they figure out that using the leeches is actually a bad way to treat someone.
Right.
They could ban the use of leeches in a medical treatment. But even in 1868, there's no example of any law anywhere, state level, local level, that interfered with the counselor-patient relationship and dictated what the counselor could and could not say. There's no history or tradition in this country of abridging that right to free speech that happens in the confines of a counselor's or a therapist's office.
Counseling didn't exist in 1868.
There wasn't a history or tradition.
Counseling didn't exist.
Right, it's just the opposite.
It didn't exist
it's
in 1868.
sacrosanct.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, in fact, we recognize a counselor-patient privilege, where even if there's a lawsuit involving something that was disclosed during the course of one of those conversations, a judge can't force the counselor to disclose what it is because we recognize the inherent freedom and privacy that both parties have in that relationship. Because if you don't have freedom in that context, how can you fairly treat anyone?
Right.
The government could tell you all kinds of things that you could and couldn't say, and it would destroy the entire profession. So counseling, although healthcare, is fundamentally different than performing surgeries and other kinds of things that involve actual medical procedures. It's pure talking. And it's a place where the government should never stick its nose.
Let's do it, John. Come on, man. make it possible for us to work, please. I like my job. I discern what I wanted to do, and I enjoy. By and large, there's hard days for sure, but I help people, and I have an opportunity to be able to listen to people's stories, and just because my values may align differently with those who are in power, doesn't mean that I should feel under threat, by what I do, and so it is tricky. It is challenging. So thank you for taking on the case of Mr. Tingley. Was that his name?
Tingley, yes.
Yeah. That we will pray for that to be able to come before the Supreme Court, because, as I mentioned, the cases that we hear about, and I think the big one, all counselors would know this one, the Michigan case, as well as the Augusta State University case. Those are the two kind of the first ones that kind of were the big ones, where students were forced to provide counseling services to same-sex couples, and they declined based on religious kind of objections, and not even in a discriminatory way. It's like, hey, there's other people in the clinic that can see these folks. Like, let's just let somebody else see them. No big deal, just not me. So nothing objectionable about that. But both these students were tossed out of their programs and thrown through the ringer, and this set a precedent, for most counseling programs throughout the country. And I think you said, I know we're kind of running short of time here, but briefly you said that the Michigan case that you were working for the Attorney General's office. Is that right? In Michigan?
Yes, and filed a friend of the court brief in support of the graduate student who was being persecuted for making that referral. And ultimately, the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals, that's the Court of Appeals for Michigan and 3 other states, ruled in her favor and vindicated her religious liberty in that context. But you can see that same thing playing out today in the gender ideology world. There's a hospital in California, and it was Catholic. And a man, actually, I can't remember now if must have been a woman who came to them who wanted to transition to be a man, and so wanted all of her female body parts removed. And the Catholic Church prohibits that. The ethical and religious directives say unless there's an urgent medical need to save the person's life or to protect them from undue harm, we don't do that. That's sterilization. And so they referred her to another hospital, and she was able to get the surgery within a matter of 2 to 3 days, but yet sued for sex discrimination. And that case is pending in the California courts right now. So even a hospital referral, a successful hospital referral, they're being punished for not adopting gender ideology in a Catholic space. And if you kind of broaden it, beyond counseling and medicine, we're seeing this everywhere. As you mentioned, this was kind of the impetus for writing the book. Teachers, high school and college professors being forced to use preferred pronouns. Parents who are having their kids being transitioned at school without their knowledge. In fact, affirmatively hiding it from them by using sex-based pronouns with the parents while using gender-based pronouns with the kids at school. We've got public accommodation laws that force medical clinics, Catholic schools, and others to treat everyone according to their gender identity and their sexual orientation instead of their biological sex. The athletic situation, that's totally exploded. We represent female athletes in some cases. We help states defend laws that save women's sports in other contexts where boys identify as girls and then win all the races. In track in Connecticut, they won 15 state titles that would have gone to girls over a 2-year period. So whether it's in the free speech context or the religious liberty context, this is just pervading the court system right now. Where just as with the counselors, those who are pushing gender ideology are trying to get everyone to agree with it and to not even talk about any other viewpoints. And what we recognize as Christians, for me as a Catholic lawyer, is that when all of culture is against what you're pushing for, then that means you're probably in the right place. And that means you found the sweet spot where you're advancing God's truth. Because throughout man's history, just read the Bible, Old Testament through the New Testament, culture was always against God's plan. And so we just need to continue to stand strong in the face of all the invective and the laws and everything else and preach the truth, because that's what we're called to do.
Amen. Amen. So where do we go from here? What's the next step?
Well, as a lawyer, I can only do so much. The ADF mission is to keep the doors open for the spread of the gospel. And so I keep the doors open so that you can do counseling, so that the teachers can speak truthfully, so that Catholic schools can teach Humana Vitae in their curriculum and post it on their website. That's why the lawyers exist. But keeping the door open only does so much. If you lose the culture, then ultimately you lose the courts, and then the courts are going to start to shut that door. And so the reason why I wrote the book, Loving God's Children, the Church and Gender Ideology, is for all Catholics out there, every Catholic in the pew who has thought a lot about gender ideology or thought very little about it, to understand why the church teaches what it does, the beautiful theology that undergirds it. Where's the science? Where does that lead us if we follow it? Where are all the governmental and societal media pressures causing our kids to adopt this ideology? And then answering common questions that people have. What if my son or daughter identifies as transgender? For a priest, what if a transgender catechumenate shows up for the RCIA program? How do I respond to that? Or to be a godparent at someone's baptism? What do I do if I'm at work and I'm asked to support Pride Month with an ally pin? Answering all those questions using church documents and great things written by our American bishops, but also things from Pope Francis and from the Vatican as well. So that with that door open, we don't know how long it's going to be open. Every single Catholic can go out and start having these conversations. First of all, you've got to catechize your kids, then you've got to talk to your extended family, you've got to talk to your neighbors, you've got to talk to your coworkers, and you've got to stand up when your employer or your public school or whoever pushes back on these things and starts to tell lies and pushes your kids in a certain direction. It's only through the efforts of the entire church that we're going to be able to turn the needle on this. But I'm confident that we can do that because we've got the truth on our side. And it's the only path to true love, willing the best of the other person. So I hope that people will hear this as a battle cry and that they'll get educated, take up arms, and do something about it. Because I'm not going to be able to save the day in the court system, but the church working as a whole will be able to save the culture, working together as an army for Christ.
Amen. Jesus, have mercy on us. John, thank you so much, man. This has been wonderful. Even just your last kind of your energy and your push about all this has been great. If people are interested in learning more about the book, where can they get it? If they want to learn more about the work of Alliance Defending Freedom, where can they get information about that?
For the book, it's actually sold out at Amazon already.
Wow.
And in any event, we really want to encourage people to support the Catholic publisher, Sophia Institute Press. Yeah. And so if you go to their website and put in my last name, Bursch, or the first words of the book, Loving God's Children, you'll be able to find that right away. Please support them. Please read the book, learn about it, and then share it with everybody that you know. This is all about evangelization, and this is an important area to do that. For those who are interested in Brian Tingley and Lori Smith and the Connecticut athletes and the many other ADF clients, you can go to adflegal.org. We are the largest public interest law firm in the world, supporting religious liberty, free speech, marriage and family, parental rights, and the right to life. You probably heard about the 303 creative case at the end of this term. You may also have heard that we helped Mississippi win the Dobbs case. We were their co-counsel to overturn Roe versus Wade. So just lots of great things happening all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. You can learn more about our cases. You can pray for our clients. They are so brave to stand up in this cultural wind and the threats that they take. They need our prayers, but pray for the lawyers too. So that's how you can find us, adflegal.org and Sophia Institute Press.
We'll have links to both of those in the show notes. And John, final question, ask all my first-time guests, what gives you hope?
Jesus Christ. That's the only thing that can give us hope when you look at all the dark things that are happening. But I'm constantly reminded by those Old Testament stories that every time that the people were unfaithful to God, he was always waiting there with open arms, just begging for them to come back. And my wife is reading a wonderful book on confession right now and made that similar point in there. The opportunity for confession isn't us going to God saying, give me another chance. It's God saying, give me another chance. Restore your relationship with me. He's always waiting there as our loving Father. And as long as we keep our eye on that prize, then everything else is going to be fine. And if every last one of us is persecuted by the modern culture for gender ideology, if we're suffering for his sake, that's okay too. because we know that the victory's already been won. We know how this ends.
Yeah. Amen. 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 John, thank you so much, man, for joining me on the show and for this wonderful conversation we had. Many blessings to you and the great work that you're doing. Many blessings on the book. May be successful, and just keep up all the great work you're doing with defending those cases and those brave clients of yours. So bless you.
And you as well. God bless.
Wow. Okay. Well, that does it for my discussion with John Bursch. I'm super grateful for John for taking the time from his very busy schedule to be able to have this conversation with me. I'm super grateful to be able to discuss everything that we did, from a deeper reassessing or re-understanding what the church teaches about the body, but then really kind of diving into what the science says as well. And then also just understanding his good work at ADF to be able to see where we can kind of grow in our abilities to defend our freedom of speech and our religious liberties. And so, again, pray for him, pray for the work that he does. Thank you for listening to the show, getting all the way to the end. Many blessings to you, and I pray that you're having an amazing day. God bless everybody, and be good.